Can I say on that? I think that's right, and on the there is part of that, of course, is at the global level. That's partly an intellectual exercise, because those fault lines fall differently in different countries. You know, you're not going to get a Norwegian style thing in America because they don't like equality. But the sorry, is the camera on?
I've fled my country. You can
But no, you know, they are going to fall in different places, so that's something that's going to need to be negotiated. There was some work that I've been doing recently in looking at sanitation in Southeast Asia that did find very strongly that investment in the government investment in housing was a very strong driver of sanitation, and something that they did from the very beginning of their growth trajectory. As you know, they had the economic growth, but they invested in sanitation right at the beginning, and invested in essentially moving people out of slums and into proper housing, which meant that they then had a variety of developmental goals covered in one. A more hygienic environment, and electricity was easier. You know, basic service provision is easier. So there's certain, and in the UK, you know, a huge amount of government investment. So I think there's a strong case that more government investment in provision of social services is a necessary part of the development trajectory. But exactly where those things fall over time is going to change.
I
think that
Sorry. There's two things that I just wanted to flag that have come out of the debate and the questions, and it stems from that question of how can the UN lead on tackling structural inequality, and Tim has hinted at something that I just want to pull out and make more explicit, which is that you can have all the frameworks that we want, but actually I think given the progress that we've made under the old MDGs and the new framing of the post-2015 agenda, there's a big question about the role of social movements in developed countries and developing countries. And there's something fundamental now about people power and the role of citizens and what they go out there and demand from their governments, but also from business as consumers. And I think that there's definitely an argument to be said that this, if you call it the last mile now, this last mile of tackling hunger and really making that step to eradicate poverty, but then sit on its back, keep it eradicated, because we won't eradicate it once. It will have to become a constant pressure. It will have to be new ways of living, new lifestyles, new choices for households, how we want to eat, how we want to clothe ourselves. You know, it's an absolute lifestyle change that is going to have to happen over time. And we haven't really talked about how our lifestyles will change, and we haven't talked about how our social movements here and in developing countries are going to have to drive the political side of the coin. And so I think it was great that question came up to flag that. But the second thing is, what do you do in places where there is no functioning state? Because actually that is where our biggest problem is, and that's where the hardest to reach people are. And, you know, political solutions, social movements, you know, assets, finances, international agreements, you could throw every trick you have in your bag at some of these really protracted and complex crises. And I think that the jury's still out on the answers and the combination of answers that will be required to start to untangle and step back and step away from some of these situations. And I do think that there's a lot of discussion about what they call constructive disengagement. So, you know, countries like America and some of the bigger European powers, Israel, for example, some of the Arab states, there are so many complicated political agendas that are getting played out in some of these contentious hotspots. There's sometimes a need for disengagement to create space to see what emerges on the national scene that could then grow and emerge in terms of solutions. And later on down that line, you would hopefully see social movements and society starting to grow back up, because there's nothing there at the moment, but grow back up, and then you see glimmers of hope. But I do think we can't underestimate the role of citizens and powers and the choice of people and social movements, the women's movements, the farmers' movements, the green movements, they've all got a crucial role to play.
Did you want
Yes, going back to your question, Shivan, of how much state and how much market should we have in society. Again, I think there we have to make a very important distinction between developing countries and developed countries. I believe that in developed countries, almost anything can be provided by the market, as long as markets are properly regulated. In this, I totally agree with you. We need strict regulation of markets. Markets are not necessarily ethical or unethical. They don't have any ethics. So we necessarily have to regulate the markets. But given proper regulation, anything practically, because we have very developed markets in developed countries. The reality is not the same in developing countries. Markets are weak over there. If you leave everything to be provided by the market, almost nothing will be provided. So basically the state has to step in, right, over there. So I think that the state is a provider of social services by default, right? In developed countries, you can leave almost anything to the market as long as you are behind regulating things. In developing countries, unfortunately, we have to rely on the state to provide the basic social services.
So it's 4 o'clock. I think we have time for a couple of burning questions, if there are any more. One? Not the mic.
I think I can just talk. The question has been already recent, but what do you do with those societies where the state doesn't work, or just the framework of the nation state can't be there? And equally, you talked about poverty, but you haven't defined it. How you define poverty and getting out of poverty? Because if you take the $1.5 a day, that's just a threshold which doesn't work. If there's someone with $1.6 a day, he's not considered to be poor, but I don't see how he or she or they live with $1.6 a day. So how do you see the idea of the nation state? Because you kind of took this for granted that nation states are everywhere, but in some places they just don't work. And then the idea of poverty. Thank you.
Any other final questions before? Because I think this will be the last round. One. You want to jump back in?
More of an argument than a question, but just that you say that the regulated markets can be helpful and stuff, but in the end, the nation state, in this country, the state was the one that has jumped in terms of debt and the most recent financial crisis. You say that the markets are stable and that in the developing countries that they're stable, but in the financial crisis, so many people have suffered, and the poor are the ones who have actually suffered more. And we have, for example, you were also mentioning the States earlier, their poverty gap is increasing, and they are all for free markets. So, just wanted to...
Is that it from the floor? Anyone have a final burning comment or question? Going once, going twice. Okay, whoever wants to speak first.
I'll jump in with this notion of how to define poverty, and I might leave the question of what do you do when there's no state to my colleagues, because I've already confessed that it's such a difficult one. I know I don't have the answer. I'd agree that the dollar a day measure for poverty is relatively crude, and all I can do is maybe talk to the definitions that we use in Concern Worldwide, because there'll be plenty of definitions out there. But recently, what we've done to help us understand what we think extreme poverty is in order to tackle it is to come up with our own measure. And what we look at internally is equality or inequality, so the levels of inequality that a particular household is facing. We look at the risks that they face on a daily basis, and we look at their vulnerability. So we'll take those three components, and based on that, we will make an assessment of where we think extreme poverty is. And what we're trying to do there is move beyond a crude understanding and recognise that poverty is fluid. You can do well for a season, you might receive a certain intervention, something happens, it knocks you back. You can climb up a wealth bracket and very quickly slip back. So we look at equality, risks and vulnerability to help understand who the poor are. We then need to understand where they are, which is an equally difficult challenge. And just bringing it back to the MDGs, I think the current model was very good at knowing what we want to do, but we didn't know who we needed to work with and where they were. And those are still big questions for the international community underneath the new framework.
Yeah, I think practically a very similar approach, looking at what inequalities exist within a country and the different dimensions of inequality. Obviously our lens, from a practical point of view, is about who's systematically not getting access to water or sanitation. I would agree that talking earlier, the huge celebration that a huge number of people have gone from $1.25 to $1.26 is not, that doesn't signify a change. And I think that was a key point earlier on about the shift needed between the Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals, that to decrease extreme poverty while increasing inequality across the globe and within countries is not, in my view, a developmental outcome. It has some crude use. It's very handy for econometrics, but it's not a measure of, you need to look at a much broader understanding of what constitutes poverty. The financial crisis, I would say, is a perfect example of a failure to properly regulate a market. There's no, there was 10 years of deregulation and then a massive crash. It should come as no great surprise. It's sort of it's a bit of a get out, because whenever you see that happening, it wasn't a regulated market. The idea of the free market as sold by sort of hardcore neoliberal people is a myth that can't exist. No intervention, no control over what can have, no rules is not a market. It's just a mess. So, it's a damaging myth, and it is a myth that is widely put out. And people say, "Oh, I want free markets." It's like, you want me to be able to steal your stuff and not be able to do anything about it? There's no, it's a sort of crazy idea when you think about it, but it's politically helpful in America.
Great. I would like to say a couple of 3 things. First of all, what the functioning of the markets has led to in America, I agree with you. It has led to levels of inequality that are unacceptable. And I think that is precisely because markets are terribly badly regulated in America, especially the financial markets. It's terrible. And the way in which the political power is in sort of alliance or is mixed with the economic power is disgusting. So that has to be fixed in America. It's not a problem of the market as a mechanism of provision of goods and services. It's a problem of lack of regulation of markets, which sometimes leads greed to be free within because it's not the markets that are malign, it's people that are using the markets for their own greed or purposes.